Yeah, I pressed record. I'm not like Dratnos. I like to record the podcast.
That's the intro, right?
Probably not. All right, welcome back to the bench, powered by Wowhead. As you know, today we have, I don't want to say a ton to talk about, so we had to curate some interesting topics. Welcome back, GROWL, and welcome back, Squishy, to the bench. How's your guys' week been?
Good. I'm pretty excited. I think there's actually lots of stuff going on. I'm feeling the hype. I know, the last couple weeks have been starting a little slow, but I'm really starting to feel the excitement, the energy building up for the new expansion.
Yeah, and for me, I'm in hotfix, covering all the hotfixes recently. They're pushing a lot of class tuning hotfixes a lot, and I'm sure we're going to talk about them today. But I did want to comment on your new hair, GROWL. You're looking quite good in that.
Thank you. Just got it done.
Really fits you.
All right, so I think the first thing that we should talk about, so we kind of, before the podcast started, we kind of discussed if Mondays or like the weekends was going to be the right time to actually record the podcast, because we didn't think that there was going to be any news that is going to happen like at the very beginning of the week. However, we were blessed today with a great hotfix post. Most of these things are like healer adjustments from my understanding, right, GROWL? Except the only thing that's like not is kidney shots now 8 seconds at 5 combo points, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, I can go over them real quick. So Dispriest, basically what it looks like, just got a flat aura buff to everything. Dispriest, one of the weaker healers right now in the beta, and you don't even see Dispriest mains playing Dispriest, so that's like the biggest red flag. And so they got a flat out damage increase and a healing increase. I think it's like 5-ish%. Also, they changed some Holy Paladin stuff. Most notably, they're removing a talent that was added that doubles the holy power that you get from Crusader Strike. A lot of Holy Paladins are upset about that. Holy Paladins are usually upset about everything. Other than that, there's not a whole lot. For the most part, they've been doing a pretty good job with trying to even out all the healers. I think there's a slight Mistweaver buff in there for Vivify healing, just to like help spot healing stuff. Overall, I think like very, very small tuning. I kind of mentioned this on the last podcast. I was assaulted in the comments about being a Blizzard shill, and that I think healer balance is actually pretty good right now. I can't speak for we never know what the world first raiders are cooking up for their top secret builds, and they're a lot smarter than me. So they might make me look like a fool in raid, but at least in dungeons, like going into dungeons and just trying to keep your team alive, I think healer balance is in like a pretty good state, and I don't expect to see any sort of like radical hotfix changes over the next couple weeks going into launch.
It's interesting that people were on your ass about saying that healers were kind of closely balanced for M+, because I actually kind of feel similarly. Why were they on you about that? Calling you a Blizzard shill?
Man, I think there's just a thing about saying positive things about WoW. Like, look, there's a lot of problems about this game, and I, notably call out some of them. But I just think that it's a little bit of a waste of energy and a little bit of like shouting into the clouds. I also think that, let's be honest, a lot of content creators do enough of that. And I feel like a lot of times I get people in my circle who are almost worried. They see all the news and like, oh no, this is going to be the worst expansion ever because I listened to XYZ. So I definitely do tend to lean on the positive side about trying to see the benefit of things and giving Blizzard the benefit of the doubt. It doesn't always work out, but I'm more, think of me as like, I'm the Zen waffle cat balancing force in the world, just trying to even out things so that people have a more, reasonable expectation.
I saw a YouTube video the other day. It was why I'm not playing Moonkin in the War Within. And in the thumbnail it said, Balance Druid sucks. So how do you feel? How do you feel about that, GROWL?
Oh, jeez. Speaking of Holy Paladins, Moonkins are right up there with the people that you can't trust. The one thing I will say, we all have to thank Tettles here, making the ultimate sacrifice, giving up Moonkin and deciding to main Augmentation for the start of the expansion, just to make sure Augmentation is crap going into Season 1 and that nobody plays it. So thank you, Tettles, for your sacrifice.
Oh yeah, no problem, buddy. Dude, dooming gets exhausting, I will say. That's the downside, GROWL. As somebody who's too positive, you gotta know that dooming does get tiring after a while.
Yeah, it gets the views, though. People love the
Okay,
Doom
I
is,
do. I will say that I hate that it gets the views. It makes it so difficult to make like really well balanced content because if you make something that's positive, people just don't click it.
Yeah, speaking of views though, like that's sort of what I meant by the hype. Like it's always a lot of fun in this time of WoW to just like make stuff just because like everybody is out here, right? Like I'm just seeing the numbers in everybody's chat, all the YouTube comments, like people are viewing, people are talking about the meta. Like I don't even while I think, you know, you can be like, "Oh, we're content creators, we make stuff." Can you hear the background noise by the way or no?
What is that?
There's it's some sort of like bug or bird or something. I don't know. Over to you, Squishy. Hold on.
Well, over to me. Well, yeah, I mean, people are really excited about the pre-patch as we commentate what GROWL is seemingly doing
okay.
background.
I mean, he definitely wasn't talking about the pre-patch, right? He's just talking. I will say that like viewership and it looks like people are really starting to get a lot more hype for the patch itself. Also, for some reason, more content creators than ever before are just making tier lists, and I think that everybody's just like, whatever, it's fine. In the past, I want to say the past couple of expansions, people got super salty over tier lists, and now it's just, I feel like everybody's just like, all right, I'm throwing my hat in the ring. This is what I think is going to be good.
Yeah, I mean, I still think it's too early with how the class tuning is still going,
yeah.
at least until the expansion launches, but like, what can you do? People are excited about the expansion, though.
Everybody knows that it's too early, and I think that that's kind of the important thing too. Is like as long as you make sure that you're like telling people, okay, there's still wild swings in terms of class tuning. You know, that's the most important thing. Like we saw just a second ago. Like we had healer changes. They didn't affect the meta today, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't do something that is really drastic in between now and like next week and something like that. Beyond that. Only other thing to cover at the top of the show is, continue to keep sending Q&A. You can either DM it to me on Discord or you can tweet at the Bench Wow on Twitter. You can also DM the Bench Wow on Twitter. The DMs are open for this Twitter account. So if you want to get your Q&A answered on the show, the best way of doing that is either DMing me or DMing it to the Bench Podcast on Twitter. Beyond that, topics for today. We got dungeons. We're going to be talking about the overall feel of the dungeons and the polish that the dungeons have. We're going to be talking about Augmentation Evoker. We're going to talk about like state of augmentation. Also, is it healthy for the game? There's going to be just like, I think a general little bit of back and forth. Squishy and I, for those who don't know, have played Aug a considerable amount at this point. We also have some timer changes in the dungeons. I think we're going to talk about DPS versus survivability and how the timer changes are going to be affecting that. And then we have some other just random tangents. And also GROWL's Rant of the Week, which I promise is going to be a good one.
I assume it's gonna be what he's doing right now. Like he's delving for a bug or something. Who knows? We're back. We're back.
We're back from our delve. Me and Bran, we've got the we've chased whatever that was. It was like a bird or something, but we're safe now. we've looted our whatever keystone fragments or whatever you get from delves, and we're ready.
Okay, so I think the first topic we want to talk about is dungeons. I have this marked down as overall feel of the dungeons. First and foremost, I guess just gut reaction. How have the dungeons been faring so far? I think that that's probably the best way to starting.
I've been playing a lot of dungeons on beta over the last couple weeks. There's been kind of like a crew. You just like wake up, get breakfast, log in, just do every dungeon once, and then be done. Sometimes you do miss a necrotic wake twice. I will say that I think they're growing on me a little bit.
Okay.
I was definitely off-put when I first started, you know, the dungeons that they brought back. We'll talk about those later. The biggest thing with regards to that, though, about the dungeons growing on me is, man, the learning curve for some of these encounters, specifically the bosses, is so crazy. Some of these bosses, like, every single expansion, it feels like they step up the difficulty and the complexity of bosses, and I really expect that, you know, if you're up for the challenge, it's gonna be a whole lot of fun early on in the season, but if you're mostly just pugging and looking to, like, get in and get your items and get out, you may be in for a little bit of a struggle. I don't know, how do you guys feel about the boss design right now?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote down consistent themes. First and foremost, I think tank survivability is a consistent theme. Also, massive healer checks and complex bosses, I think, are very large themes. And the complex bosses, I think, matches up with the healer checks. It kind of makes me question whether or not we're going to have like Dragonflight Season 1. If you guys remember how that season started out, there was a couple of fights like Raging Tempest, Last Boss of Court of Stars, where there was just like insane healer checks on some of those bosses. I kind of expect us to be in a similar situations where some of your healers get put on fraud watch and aren't able to heal some of the bosses. Like it is very challenging right now. I'm a bit concerned. I kind of expect some of these bosses to get tuned down a little bit because average players aren't going to be able to deal with them.
I have a feeling they're going to nerf them after it goes to Mythic Plus, maybe like a week or two in. I think M0, that's our content for a full week, or for the Dungeoners content for a full week. I have a feeling that's going to be kind of where that's almost tuned. And then if things are, like how many times did Raging Tempest get nerfed? Like 3 or something at least?
Something like that, yeah.
So I assume that they're going to start tuning things down once they actually get their data. But it'll probably take them some time to do so, to figure out what the actual issue is. Because sometimes, like how much of it is just going in, with limited knowledge versus an actual healing throughput issue.
I mean, GROWL pointed out the fact that limited knowledge is like very tough for some of these dungeons. I'm thinking like Dawnbreaker and Stone Vault. Like if you zone into those keys without like perfect knowledge of the bosses and like what you're supposed to be doing, you're probably gonna rack up 30 or 40 deaths in that dungeon.
Sure. But I mean, you're doing a full week of M0s before Mythic Plus this time, so theoretically you could learn stuff there. I'm pretty sure that like the duo in Stonevault will kill you if you on M0 if you don't know what you're doing.
I mean, yeah, but like,
all right. Well, as the official paid Blizzard chill positive guy, I actually want to say that I think the M0 bridge in between heroic like dungeons and Mythic Plus is going to be really, really good. I don't think people realize how smooth the M0 experience is going to be because the difficulty of M0 is ramped up, right?
Yeah.
This isn't normal M0. We're talking about what was previously like a key level, let's say 5 to 10, which in any other season that we've had this so far, that isn't really a thing. Like 2 to 10s late in the expansion are basically just for gearing. Like you started at an 11 or whatever, and then your weekly is a 20. But at the beginning of an expansion, like a +5 key or a +6 key is like real for a lot of people. Like even in the previous season. So an M0 is going to be actually a very, very challenging experience. And being able to go into the dungeon, number one, and with no timer, no affixes, and just sort of like really get to fight the bosses and see how the bosses feel. And also to have that lockout of, oh man, like our guild group, we just wiped to this boss 3 times. You can literally go out, go get gear, come back the next day, and then try the dungeon again or whatever. And it's like, I feel like it's going to be a much better experience for the learning and gearing up process. So I'm kind of hoping, if you're somebody who's worried about the difficulty or like, you haven't been playing on beta or you feel like you'll be behind, I think that Mythic 0 week, especially if you have alts and you can kind of check out each dungeon multiple times when you have the time, I think that M0 week will be a good learning experience, but I do still think the dungeons are like very, very hard.
It's more just like there's like a few bosses where you just like stroll up to the boss, and more often than not there's like 1 or 2 mechanics that you could just like explain in a couple of sentences, and then there's a couple of bosses where I could tell you the mechanics for like 5 minutes, and at the end of it you're like, what? And then you're just like, all right, we're pulling the boss, you'll figure it out, I guess.
Yeah, you walk up to a boss and normally, like, let's say you're playing with a buddy who's never played before, you, like, summarize it in one thing, you're like, all right, when he does this, get in the circle and then dodge the lines. And then
like
when you go up to when you go up to Stone Vault, I remember we were playing with somebody and we were teaching him, and we walk up to this boss, and then Dorky just says, good luck, and just pulls the boss. Like, that was his explanation for this boss, and it's just like, there's so much going on in terms of like there's a kick, and also the boss jumps around and you need to like follow him to get the kick, and there's like AOE damage, and like certain spots are safe, and like sometimes the box just like flies across the room and other times it stops and it blows up, and it's like, yeah, it's a very, very complicated fight. I mean, as an M+ enjoyer, you like complicated fights and fights that have a lot of depth, and it feels good once you've mastered it, but it's like, I have the luxury of playing with 4 people who are like, okay, let's pull this boss 7 times in a row and learn. But in a pug, you have that one guy that's like, oh, this sucks, my team's dumb, and
I'm
he just
leaving.
leaves. Yeah, exactly. And I really worry that, people are concerned about pug difficulty on week 1, and yeah, find some friends, get in these dungeons with some people that because pugging will be a lot more difficult.
So what I will say is I'm not in love with the dungeon pool specifically, but I'm having a lot of fun doing the dungeons, if that makes any sense. I don't think the dungeons are like the most interesting thing that we've ever had, especially if you get stuck in like Grim Batol. Borealis feels the same as it did in the past, like that kind of thing. But at the same point, it's not like I'm having like an unenjoyable time. Like it is an enjoyable experience to continue to do the dungeon. So that's at least positive, I think, with M Plus as a whole.
I think dungeons that just themselves are always gonna be fun with friends. Like no matter what dungeons you're doing, I think you're always gonna have some amount of fun, especially if it's not sanguine or bolstering anymore. Like
True.
you just get to kind of game with your friends, get to kill some mobs, and for those who want to push and kind of overcome challenges, like it's just gonna be a good time. There's definitely something to be said if you're pugging for gear or score or stuff like that, then there's probably gonna be some frustrations there.
I think the beta testing experience has been a lot different. So we got bumped up to 626 this most recent week, and so now we're actually able to test the keys at like a pretty high level. And I will say that the dungeon testing experience has been a little bit different once you're no longer having to play with those affixes that they've been adding in.
Yeah, another thing I want to mention along with the item level with regards to healer checks is that I don't want people to be that concerned looking at these super high keys that people are doing. Once you're doing the very high keys, like 12 plus, there are going to be some pretty severe healer checks. I think healing is like quite difficult right now. A lot of that has to do with how much burst damage there is in the dungeons, but at a certain level, that burst damage is going to kill your party in that burst, right? Like, even if they're topped, the burst damage, you're going to need to have some sort of healing or cooldown plan for that.
Yeah.
For most people, while you're gearing up, you're doing a +2, a +3. That burst damage isn't going to kill you, right? It's going to be scary. It's going to drop your party low. But ultimately, the goal of the burst damage is just to make it so you have to top everybody up before the next event, and you're not going to need a bunch of cooldowns planned. So, like, the adding Tyrannical on 10 and adding the Zalateth Bargain or whatever with the 20% damage, that significantly ramps the amount of damage that the bosses and the mobs are doing. And so I think a lot of people have shown concern that healing is going to be too bursty and like too crazy. And while in high keys it might, for most people while you're gearing up in the opening weeks, I don't think it's going to be nearly as bad as you might be watching on streams right now.
Yeah, I think that you have to really factor in whenever you see like 3 and 4 minute bosses that +12 affix that you get, that bargain is. That's like the biggest piece of it. Whenever you're doing keys that are below a 12, you are just like absolutely slaughtering the bosses. The bosses are like 2 minutes long and stuff like that. But the moment that you put that +12 affix on it, that multiplicative scaling, it really starts to ramp up really quickly.
I think that most of the time, especially in 10s, like, because that's mostly all I do, that people are going to die early on is when you fail the mechanics. You get hit by that box that we saw earlier.
That box is tough. That movement is really rough, actually.
Or you stand in the fire, or like on other bosses, there's dragons flying across, and you have to dodge the breath. Like mechanics that you need to figure out. I think gearing up, more people are going to die to that than like a lack of a healer check.
I will say, okay, there are bosses. GROWL described it as like burst damage. So in the past, like couple of patches, we had a lot of one shots. Now I think Blizzard is really going for, like GROWL was saying, like burst damage that you still want to like press a defensive on. Like GROWL, they're gonna be wiping here. Let me back this up a second.
Yeah, you see the boss enraged, and you're like, okay, this is not
show them off
fair.
Like the boss like enraged, but like, okay, so he does like an alarm shrill and he does a gossamer burst. I would say the alarm shrill probably does like 150% of your health, so like a health bar and a half. So this can be mitigated by either pressing like a fairly strong defensive, or it can be alleviated by having a very, very strong healer cooldown. So like you, like on whenever GROWL's here playing this Preservation Evoker, say he presses something that's like a very large, like a rewind or something like that, that will actually be able to cover it. But I think that for a lot of players, and particularly a lot of healers, they end up pressing a lot of their defensives and a lot of their healing abilities reactively as opposed to proactively, and don't really understand when that's coming. And I'm a bit worried for like the average player experience that it's going to be a bit tough, because there are a lot of bosses with very fast burst healing that you need to just know that is coming.
Yeah, I was talking about this on stream yesterday, and by talking about it, I mean raging about it. And that there's a lot of times when it's not very clear. Like, I really feel like in terms of if you want to step it up and like be doing higher keys, you are so dependent on add-ons when it comes to weak auras and like seeing the ICDs of mobs. Like, there's a lot of mobs that you guys will see where you walk into a pack and you're like, okay, this seems fine. But really, there's one mob that's super dangerous that does like a giant party-wide AoE that starts like 5 seconds into the pull. And unless you're literally like, and again, I'm talking about high keys specifically, or just very undergeared, but unless you're ramping up and getting all that healing ready and preemptively using defensives, you're just dead. It's not a matter of like, oh no, we're taking damage. Should I press my wall? Okay, you're dead by then. Because the damage comes so fast. So I think that I wonder how the difficulty will be, right? Like, I wonder if you step foot in there in a +6, it takes your party down to 20% health, and then as a healer you slowly learn, and then the next one takes your party down to 5%, and then hopefully by then the time that you get to 10s you learn. I'm not really sure. It's hard right now because just one last thing, the item level scaling on beta is a little bit weird. Like, whatever level content you're doing, it scales your item level to that content. So it's like you're doing a 10 but it moves your item level down, you're doing an M0, it moves your item level way down. So like all of the levels feel kind of samey, and so it's hard to really tell what it's going to be like when you're gearing up on the first week or whatever.
What do you think about the War Within dungeons versus like the returning dungeons? Because now that I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking like a lot of the healer checks are, funnily enough, in the new dungeons. I don't think Mist doesn't have like an insane healer check. It has like a pretty large damage check. Morales doesn't have a healer check. Wake doesn't really have a healer check.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I think in general, that's something that we saw in Dragonflight as well, right? Ruby Life Pools, Halls of Infusion, Brackenhide. Well, Brackenhide, once they nerfed everything, didn't really, but you get the idea, right? Like, I think
Nuke Defensive, yeah.
Yeah, I think they really, part of what they're designing is they want to keep healers busy and do a lot of group damage, and that's just like sort of their new design philosophy. They are adding some things in the older dungeons that have, like, for instance, they reworked the second boss of Siege so that Siege now has a mechanic that does group damage that you need to heal through. Again, it's just like a very, very bursty. Yeah, so it's a spell called Fiery Ricochet, where it's very, very quick. Every 20 seconds, she shoots something out. It goes on 4 of the 5 players, and it's just like a very nasty dot that you have to heal through.
Yeah, it's more I haven't seen it on your party, GROWL. Maybe some other parties,
Stuff happens, right?
GROWL's just too strong. He tops his group before it actually matters. It's scary for other healers, of course.
Yeah, surely. But yeah, I think so the thing with the older dungeons, a lot of people have specific thoughts on them. I think they have the full ability to do whatever they want with the old dungeons. They can take a great dungeon and make it crap. They can take an old dungeon that's bad and make it good. Like, Siege is a really interesting one where, I mean, I'm not gonna, it was literally one of the worst, if not the worst dungeon in BFA.
It is my pick for like worst dungeon of all time. Yeah. It is by far my least favorite dungeon.
But 3 of the reasons that it was bad was the scaling on the second boss, that it would keep going invulnerable, the scaling on the last boss, the fact that you'd have to fight the tentacles, and the annoying spotter shenanigans, and all 3 of those got completely removed from the dungeon. So while I wouldn't, Siege in its current state, I would say is like actually kind of mid in terms of BFA dungeons now if it would have been this iteration. So I think they can just sort of do whatever they want to do with the older dungeons, and they can make them good, they can make them bad. Ultimately, it feels like they're really leaning towards like wanting to make things challenging and wanting to add complicated mechanics. But with Siege specifically, I do like the fact that they fixed a lot of problems with things that were in the dungeon.
I think this is the best version that we're going to get of Siege of Borealis. I think at the end of the day, it's still Siege of Borealis, and it feels like you're playing the same dungeon, but it's I do think it's like a better version of it. Squishy, do you like the fact that they're rotating dungeons every single season, even if it requires this?
Yeah, I think so. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. It's a fresh take. You get new dungeons to play with your buds. Like, you get to learn new things. I think I don't mind that. Like, Grim Batol is basically nothing like the old Grim Batol in a way. Like, it is pretty spanking new. And we saw with Halls of Valor back in the day, they changed that from a pretty hated dungeon to a pretty good dungeon.
That got really good. Everbloom got good too.
Other than fixes, but like, they can do whatever they want to echo GROWL sentiment there. I think The biggest thing that stands out though is just the lack of healer checks in older dungeons compared to newer dungeons. They add,
So we need
one
more.
thing here and there, but like the newer dungeons, they're threatening to kill you. The healers need to pump hard to keep your group alive.
That's a good point. We should actually make harder healer checks at all of the dungeons, really make them sweat.
Man, one thing I learned from talking with people is that people do not like dying because of their healer. Like, I understand now why the healer role is such like a weird thing, because you go on beta right now, right? And people love doing Mist. They love doing Necrotic Wake. And it's like, why is that the favorable dungeon? It's like, well, they don't have to worry about dying all the time. Like, but the DPS and tanks, like, they just want to go in and they just want to deal a lot of damage. And people... it's very weird because healers, this is like kind of a tangent, but healers really like being tested and like being able to heal for the most part. Maybe not all the time, but that's a fun part of playing healer. No one else in the group likes that. Nobody else in the group wants to be 1% health just hoping that their healer is playing well. So it's like a weird situation. It's the same as like mana for a healer, right? Like managing your mana and helping your team go faster in the dungeon is very fun for a healer. For 4 of the 5 party members, it's not fun at all to sit there while your healer is sleeping on the floor eating a feast and you're just like, can we go? Like, what are you doing? And it's a very, very weird situation for healers right now, and that I think there's a lot of different people thinking that healing should be a lot of different things. And it's also tough because in lower dungeons, it's a lot different from higher level, right? Like in lower level dungeons, people stand in crap, they get hit by frontals, but you can heal it, right? And then in higher level dungeons, they don't do that, but because they're getting one shot, and then it's like more of a supporty kind of like DPS role. So yeah, I don't know. It's definitely weird that it does kind of feel like they're using the dungeons to kind of shape what they want healing to be.
What do you think about this JB tweet? He says, war within dungeons are currently tuned to be difficult to heal. This means you have to bring a healer, and they have to be good. This has made people very mad, and they will ask for the dungeons to be nerfed so that they can continue to call their healer a payphone role.
Yeah, this is based. I mean, I hope that we get to the point where tanks are like tanks. Look, let's be honest. Everybody hates tanks. Tanks are entitled. They're whiny. I'm sorry. I'm going to say it, but you can't tell them that because you wake up the next day. You're like, hey, that's weird. I didn't get a message to do keys, and then your tank's in a group with Ellismere or Greg or any other, and you're like, well, okay, there goes my tank, right? Like tanks. I wish healers were like that. I wish even if we were a payphone role and you want our role to be easy and you don't want to have healing checks, at least like be nice to us then. Why do we have to get under attack on Twitter all the time? So I respect that JB take that it's like, look, if you want healing to be easy and you want us to be OP, then be nice.
It's just weird because I think that for some reason healing is the role that players are so unwilling to let your healer like wipe your group to like a healing check. If you wipe to a damage check, it's fine. If anybody wipes to dying to like something stupid or like a mechanical mistake, it's fine. If your tank gets melee to death, it's fine. God forbid if your healer fails a healer check and you guys wipe to that, it is like hell is coming and the world is ending and the boss has to get nerfed tomorrow.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I was listening to Meg talk about this too because she's normally a Mistweaver player who's been playing some Windwalker and some other stuff. And I totally related in terms of my mage adventures in that when you play DPS, like if you die, you're just sort of like whatever, you're like, yeah, that was fun. Like if anything, if you die, you're like, okay, nice, I get to do the fun pulls again. Like instead of having to do this annoying boss gauntlet, you're like, okay, let me do the 3 giant fun pulls again. As a healer, you feel so bad when people die. Like when you mess up your cast sequencing or like lose sight and stand in a puddle and die, and then you're like, it just feels so bad when you deplete a key as a healer or a tank. And it's like, I don't really know a great way to fix that, but it definitely does feel like part of the appeal of DPS and why there's so many people that play DPS is it's just sort of like, your mistakes feel like they have less impact, even though I will say it's more of a feeling. Like playing DPS and doing your role is very, very important, and doing good damage is important. But in terms of like feeling, like you much less often have that feeling of like, yeah, I just completely wasted everybody's time of 25 minutes in this key because I stepped in one swirly.
I will say, I don't think the healer role in M+ has, at least in my opinion, enough agency to like wipe your group. But whenever they design these healer checks that are strong, and it does, then people get very upset, and then they inevitably nerf the healer checks because then they're a bit too tough for your average player.
I mean, I think everybody just the blame the healer thing is always a thing. Even when you have lower DPS, you get an extra like storm or an extra AOE phase or something. Like that's not attributed to the low DPS.
Yeah.
That's attributed to your healer for not being able to heal the 5th storm or whatever, the 5th AOE phase. And that's just like the perception of how things go, because there's no like this like enraged timers exist in raid fights for a reason. That is your DPS check. It does not exist in dungeon bosses. And therefore, if a dungeon boss takes an extra minute, all that extra difficulty goes on your healer. It doesn't go on your damage dealer. And like there really is nothing threatening the DPS right now, because, as we've talked about before, the only DPS check is the timer. And that is a global overall thing that kind of gives any feedback to how much a DPS is supposed to do. There's no quantifiable metric for what a DPS is supposed to do. You can't say you did low DPS on this boss. Like, what does that even mean? Given your gear, like there's no recommended item level for each difficulty, so you can't even tell if you're above or below geared or anything like that. Like, how do you tell? And that's kind of the problem that I think for non-top end players.
I will say, once you start to get into like the high end community, it becomes like less of a thing. Sometimes you'll wipe to a healer check and people won't be like, this fucking healer's dog shit. I mean, it happens sometimes, but like in general, most people don't then go to immediately like shitting on your healer. It's definitely like a pug key mentality thing where you just completely blame the healer for anything that has ever gone wrong in your entire life.
Yeah, that is a great segue towards the other part of dungeons that I think is very important to talk about right now is the timers. So right now people are noticing the pretty heavy difficulty of dungeons on beta. Now we're testing with 626 item level, which is pretty significantly geared. It's not quite max, but I think it's like max heroic / early mythic track gear. And people are like doing 13s, 14s, when traditionally, you might be used to doing 20s or, stuff way above 10s. And people are sort of saying, okay, these dungeons look really, really hard. I mentioned it earlier. I thought the mechanics were pretty hard. So Blizzard comes out with a dungeon tuning post. What do? They nerf the timers of multiple dungeons. And a lot of people are really worried about this. But I think that if Blizzard gets the tuning right, if they fix the individual mechanics that are very problematic in the dungeons and maybe simplify some of the bosses, I'm not saying they will, I'm saying if they do, I think that this is a great change for Mythic Plus because it's going to bring that focus more on let's have a clean run where we're trying to focus on dealing a lot of damage and not just we're throwing our bodies in, that second room of Dawn of the Infinite where there's just the debuffs that just kill you repeatedly and you have 17 deaths, but it's fine.
I haven't thought about that. that debuff was cursed. Yeah.
Well, somebody commented on my video talking about that and basically like, how does GROWL think the timer changes are good when he just runs it down mid in Dawn of the Infinite and dies 7 times to the debuff in the same key? And at first glance, it's like, yeah, these death timers are going to be really punishing, but the important thing people have to realize, you're not going to be in a key that's that crazy, right? The whole problem was that the timer was so free, and you end up in this key that's doing crazy amounts of damage because you just 2-chested a key that was 2 levels below that you shouldn't have. And now you're in this crazy key level. It will definitely be a little bit of a rude awakening if you're expecting to do X level of key because of last expansion. It'll be a rude awakening while you're gearing up. But once you kind of get settled in and snug with like, okay, I'm geared up and I'm doing 10s or whatever level that you're comfortable with, I think the timers your average run is going to have way less deaths. You're not going to be wiping, like people are worried, oh no, one wipe is going to be everyone disbands. Well, you're going to wipe a whole lot less because you're not fighting these crazy bosses that are doing insane group damage once you get the mechanics down. I will be a little frustrating in the beginning, especially if you're trying to push Mythic Plus with people who don't know what's going on in them, in the dungeons and people are wiping. But I think that once things get settled in, I think these changes will slowly grow on people and they will like the timer changes.
I think that that might be only a thing for like high end players. I think that for average weekly key doers, they're just in there to get the gear, right? They're just in there to time the key on a 10 to get their portal. They're in there to get whatever cosmetic that they're looking for, Keystone Master or whatever. And so I don't think they would give a shit if Necrotic Wake was 32 versus a 36-minute timer. I don't think they give a shit as to whether the death timer is 5 seconds or 15 seconds. I do tend to agree that and this is especially true for high-end players, you shouldn't be in a key that you have no business being in regards to your skill, your damage, those things. And so by making the timers a lot closer to where they should be, that is beneficial, I think, as a whole. But I think for most players, they don't give a shit.
I think it also shifts, a little bit more back into the risk-reward playstyle. Like, you might just take a risky pull a little bit safer and split it into 2, just to make sure that you don't lose an extra, 45 seconds on the timer because you had 3 deaths, because of that extra affix that now makes deaths even more punishing in the War Within. You might, especially for the 10 crowd, you might just play things a little safer if you want to go from a 9 to a 10, rather than double or triple pulling and hoping for the best.
Yeah, it also just won't be the norm. That's another theme of these dungeons that I'm seeing, and I think that it's less interesting and less fun at a high level, but for a lot of people, that doesn't really matter, and if anything, it's better. And that the pacing of the dungeon is very much intended to be like, okay, we do this pack, okay, we do this pack, okay, now we move on to the next pack, okay, now it's the boss. It's very much not, if you look at the end of Dragonflight, it would be, even in a group that wasn't that high level, you would go into the first pull of Ruby Life Pools, and your tank would pull 3 packs, and then, you would be expected to do this, CCing with Fear Sigil and all this stuff, and it's granted, pulling big is fun, and in high-level groups, I think having those options is fun, but for a lot of people who are just, wanting to go 1 pack at a time, I think these dungeons are more catered towards that sort of gameplay, if you will.
Well, I mean, that's true to a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I think you're just talking about the dungeons, like you were saying. There's a lot of mechanics that don't let you pull more than 1 pack at a time. There's a couple of mechanics that have this infinitely stacking debuff on you, and if you pull 2 stack horns, you pull 2 of the mobs at the end of Stone Vault, or you pull just 2 of whatever mob, they'll stack this debuff on you infinitely and wipe you after a certain period of time. So there's some packs that Blizzard just doesn't allow you to pull together. But then on top of that, like you were saying, I think that one of the bigger changes too is just making mobs recast on CC. That's a massive change from Dragonflight going into War Within, is just every single mob will recast. So for most groups, their best experience is going to be literally holding W through the dungeon, pulling 1 pack at a time. Sometimes you can get spicy and pull 2. and that's the situation. But I don't think you're going to see the first pull of Azure Vault anymore. I don't think that's going to be something that's really on the table for a lot of groups. Outside of maybe Necrotic Wake, where you can still pull 25 mobs in the first pull, but I don't think that's something that a normal group is going to be doing anyways.
Yeah, to elaborate more on the CC changes. So in previous expansions before Dragonflight, let's say there was a cast that you could interrupt with a kick or whatever. If you didn't interrupt it, but you stunned it by some means, it was sort of a crapshoot as to what would happen. Sometimes that spell would go on cooldown, sometimes it would stop it. You didn't really know, and it created this really weird learning curve, because there would be some spells where you would want to stun them and not interrupt them because they would go on cooldown anyway, and you could save your interrupts. So in Dragonflight, they sort of fixed this, quote unquote, and they made it so every single cast, if you stun it, interrupt it, disorient it, anything, it goes on cooldown immediately. So what that sort of brought up was, well, now you don't really have this meta of, okay, hey, you get this flower, I'll get this flower. What happens is you pull all the mobs, and then it's just what really happened is your Demon Hunter just CC'd them 7 times in a row, and then you hoped your mage would come into melee to press 1 freaking button while he's combusting.
But he didn't.
But he didn't, and then you would wipe to the flowers anyway. So the change that they made is now it's the reverse. Now, if you ever stop anything, no matter what, it's gonna recast immediately when it's unstunned or uncc. And I think that it's gonna be a little bit weird for people, but ultimately with some improvements, I think it could be a really good system. First of all, I really like the idea of assigning kicks, right? Okay, this is a volley, you are in charge of this. Okay, this is this mob, you're in charge of this. Everyone has their job when they go into a pull, and you know what to do. The more you pull, the more jobs that each person may have to go through. And I think in general, that's pretty healthy. Also good for pugs because it doesn't really require comms, right? Okay, you're Skull, I'm Star. You know, if there's anything else, the mage gets it, and then you just walk into a pack. The tank just marks them or whatever. Blah blah blah. The problem, to me, there's two major problems.
Yeah.
Number one is the fakes. So let's say Tettles is assigned to a kick, but Tettles might be talking to his stream about why he's not playing Boomkin this season, and the cast is about to go off, and I see it, and I'm like, oh no, let me stun it. But Tettles was in control; he was watching it, and so I stun it, and then Tettles wastes his solar beam because he's playing Boomkin, and then now the mob just recasts, and we don't have his solar beam because I stun the mob. I don't see them doing this, but I would like to see some sort of like weird spell batching fix where if you happen to throw a kick within a short time of it being stunned or disoriented, then it still goes on cooldown. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think that's reasonable?
Upheaval is by far the biggest offender of this. Aug with like a rotational knockup just does this thing where it's really easy to juke kicks. I do wish that they would have something to solve this because it's so easy to whiff your kick on accident. And there's like a couple of dungeons that have pretty kick intensive like areas. I think like the first area of Arakara and the first area of City of Threads have enough interrupts to where like if you accidentally whiff something to a CC, you might like just die to the bolts that are like firing off at you. So if they could come up with something with like you're saying spell batching or something like that, say you kick into the mob on accident like right after it gets CC'd, but its ability goes on cooldown, that would be nice. And I think that's kind of why I preferred the situation where like all CC worked the exact same as an interrupt, because it just was more intuitive that way, and it made it a lot easier. Like like there was like some recourse where if somebody actually missed a kick, you could actually just press a stop. But
yeah, I know people have suggested like, oh, your kick only goes on cooldown when you actually kick, but like that has some problems in that you'll probably just macro kick into every ability.
Oh my god,
or a lot of abilities,
yeah,
and then just spam it until it actually hits something. So like that's not reasonable, and like I don't know what the solution is for that. And I think it might just come down to it's just a coordination issue that you just need to trust, which is really hard to do. You just need to trust people that they're going to hit the kick, and if that doesn't happen, then just ask what happened.
I have an idea. What if it's like Dispel, where it's on GCD? You move all the kicks onto GCD.
Oh my god! So my options right now are my kick is on a GCD, or I need to trust Tettle's Boomkin. All right, what's the next option, Squishy?
We could go back to all the stops work. but I will say for like average players, I think it's more important now that you're tracking a lot of your group's CC and a lot of your group's interrupts to really like. You should have been doing this before, but like most of the people don't. But now it's going to be more important to really know who's going to have a kick available for what mob. I don't think that they should put, for the record, I don't think they should put kick on GCD. That would be fucking annoying.
Yeah, I mean, go play Classic if you want to do that again.
Was it on GCD in Classic?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
You had to hold. I'm pretty sure you did have. I think so, at least. Maybe that was taunt.
Do you remember when people got pissed that all their movement abilities got put on the GCD?
God.
It would just be like that again.
Oh, you play Classic. Wasn't kick on the GCD?
It just was wildly like all over the place. I might be being dumb here. There's no way it works like this on live. But so for on my Rogue on Classic, your kick requires energy, and so you also regenerate energy very slow. And so like there will be a situation where you're holding your damage buttons because you need to kick because you don't want to get bottomed out on energy and not have enough energy to kick a spell. So that's definitely a thing in Classic. I think some of the kicks are on global, some of them are not. It just depends on the class.
But like on the topic of kicks, we saw something like pop up a little more recently on Dragonflight. I'm curious on War Within because you guys have done a lot of dungeons. Is there anti-sync cast tech that they started using more?
Where are they using it? I actually don't even know where they're using it.
First of all, for people who don't know, this is tech that they seemingly use more now, where multiple of the same mob cannot cast the same spell at the same time.
Yeah.
This is most notable in Knockhood around the pillar area with the birds. Only one bird can cast at the same time, which makes it really hard to AoE stop the mob because there's only one. So, like, how much is there in War Within, GROWL?
Yeah, so there's actually a really quick history on that. So they're in beta of Dragonflight, there were these Skitterfly mobs in Algathar Academy. They would charge a random player. And so it was really fun because there was 3 of them in a pack, and they would just all 3 charge one player and kill you instantly. And so Blizzard said, how do we make this better? So they looked at, it's like when you look at like the child that's doing well versus the like abandoned child, which is M+. So they look over to Raid and they think, well, what would we do in Raid? And in Raid, there are mechanics where it just doesn't let you target the same guy a bunch of times in a row, and there are internal cooldowns for abilities, and it won't just like go off over and over and over again. So Blizzard added it to those mobs, and they've been slowly adding it to more and more mobs. One of the things is mobs that have these big AoE, like I mentioned earlier, the big healer, like AoE things that mobs do. Almost all of them. So for instance, I believe I don't know if this specific one, the Staghorn AoE, but some of the other mobs, like for instance, the ones in Stone Vault that go off, that there's one that stacks, one that doesn't. Basically, any group AoE spell will like go on this weird internal cooldown where it won't double up and happen at the same time. The most obvious one is the golems at the very beginning of Stone Vault.
Oh yeah.
And so there's a lot more of those. There's some at the end of City of Threads, those like casters in the cocoon area.
The wave mobs, you're right.
Yes,
Yeah,
yep,
that's the
waves.
one I know.
Yes. So in general, that's something that's interesting, and I think it's good to know how that works. There's sort of like this, I found there's this like 3-second grace period with everything, with boss spell queuing and with mob spell queuing, and that when like, let's say there's an ability that goes off, you can almost like count to 3 in your head and know that there's going to be another one coming if you're fighting multiple of that, or if there's a boss that has like abilities spell queued. So that's kind of like a good thing to know in the back of your head, is like, you know, that's if there's anything that's lined up, it's going to happen 3 seconds back to back. So like, you know, you can fit in certain things in between it. This is mainly like a healer thing if there's like 2 big AoE bursts or whatever. So not much. It's just something to watch out for, because it's always good to know like how the mobs are coded and how the mechanics work and what you need to be looking out for when you're doing the dungeons.
I do think the anti-sync tech is like pretty good. They used it on oh gosh, the Shadow Moon Burial Grounds blueberries as well.
Yep.
That was
yeah, that was like one of the first AoEs that they did that. Yeah.
Yeah. I do think it's in general like a pretty good fix for some of the issues that they were having with the mobs. At the end of the day, I think that you're gonna have to like for like pugs and stuff like that. I think that what GROWL is saying, having like a good auto marker and having people like set up and like marking what mob they're going to be kicking pretty consistently is important. And also knowing the cooldown of like mobs abilities and having like ICD trackers on the mobs abilities, it's going to be important to like know, especially since stops can't cover the gap a little bit. I don't love that that's going to be a thing, right? Like it's like GROWL, whenever we started off this conversation, he was talking about the dungeons and was saying that they're so weak aura dependent, and that's just like another thing that's more, you know, add-on UI dependent. It's gonna have like that big dependency of just making sure that you know what the ICD of some of these abilities are.
Yeah, I hate it. I think they're getting better slowly, but the problem is the ability of players just far surpasses like the developer strategies and the way that they implement things. So like one example that is in Arakara, there are these caster mobs that cast this volley. And one thing they added is these mobs like glow green when they're doing this lethal volley that you're supposed to interrupt. And so visually you see, oh, this is an important thing. This is going on. I need to stop this when they're casting this. It's like it's almost like PvP-esque. It's a very noticeable cast animation. So I think one thing that I would like to see is some of these mobs that do this big AoE group damage to sort of do that as well, even if it's unavoidable or unkickable. You know, how they have those like weird, I don't know, even like a chat message of like, you know, oh, the despoiler begins to glow, and you know, you see that, and then it's like built into the game. You don't need big wigs to tell you that it's about to happen. You see it like, you know, maybe start to get dark, or like a lightning comes out of it or whatever, and then it's like, oh, as a healer, you know, oh no, this is the guy that does AoE damage, he's lighting up, he's about to blow up, let me, you know, get ready to press a defensive or something. I would like to see that. I think they're working in that direction. They're just slow. I think their mechanic complexity is going too fast rather compared to their like telegraphing ability.
I agree. I also think that cast times, like the duration of how long mobs take to cast, sometimes you'll have abilities that can like wipe you if they go off, and they'll be on like a 2.5 second cast, and you're just like, holy shit.
Oh. Oh, I guess one example that I like is so the same area in Arakara, of the volleys is those alerting shrills, right?
That's
So
good.
there's these
That's
like
a good
alarming bugs. There's these alarming bugs, right? That if you pull them, they sit there and they channel a 10-second cast. If you don't stop it, they turn into like this giant Omega monster. That's very bad. But every time you pull it, it puts up this chat message that says like, "Oh, a shrill has been alerted," or some weird message, and it tells you that it's about, you know what I mean, and it gives you a ton of time to react to it. And to me, like, I think they should have like those big scary group damage moments in that same vein of just like lets everybody know if it's going to be this crazy group damage to sort of because there's always this big complaint of like, oh, DPS never press defensives or whatever, but how are they supposed to know, unless you literally have weak auras and ICDs and all this stuff that's telling you what to do? Like, how are you going to know this mob unless you literally have done the dungeon 10 times and you know exactly when the cast is about to happen?
Dude, Dawnbreaker is by far the most brutal for, I think, dungeon knowledge versus like being able to just like jump on in there and do it the first time. I think that for players, if you watch a guide of Dawnbreaker. Alternatively, doing it on M0 with your friends is important. But like the fact that you have to know that you're killing mini bosses, where the mini bosses are, where you're supposed to be flying to, and then on top of that, just know the mechanics of the dungeon. There's only a specific spot that you can even tank the second boss because it's going to wipe you to the orb mechanic. There's like a bunch of like random niche rules that you need to know going into the Dawnbreaker in general. And I think that that's just like I don't know. I think that there's a lot of complexity, and like GROWL was saying, I do think that echoing the sentiment of the mob complexity is moving faster than the VFX is kind of true.
We'll have a contest on the first week of Mythic Plus. Viewers submitted. Whoever has the most deaths in a Dawnbreaker, who gets most overtime and still completes it, will win.
Dude,
something.
What is the most deaths you've had in the Dawnbreaker on the beta?
99.
Dude, I had 75 in one of mine, too.
We actually uploaded our 99 death run to YouTube as well.
Did you really? That's sick.
Yeah, everybody's. I'm not trying to call anybody out, but people are uploading. Oh, crazy plus 14. This and that. The runs that I have are just 2 Dawnbreakers that are both just like 99 deaths. Like nonsense. It's just so good. It's so good.
So with the reduction of like kicks and stops, then what is the purpose of stops then in War Within dungeons? Like, does it have a use at this point then?
Delay the casts to where your kick comes back up because you accidentally whiffed your kick. It's still good. I mean, it's good tank damage reduction and stuff like that, right?
Of course, like that is obviously good, but like just thinking about it, like, is there a world where people talent out of their AOE CCs? And
yeah, they're way less valuable, right? It's something that is interesting from a, like, for instance, a Boomkin perspective of they buried in Cap Roar so far deep to the point where you have to take basically 3 talents to get in Cap Roar, right? It takes 3 points. In Dragonflight, that's a no-brainer. You need that, right? But I think, is it really worth it to put 3 points in to get in Cap Roar when it's not even, it's just going to make mobs recast anyway? I think what I like about it is that it sort of brings back the spells to do what they're supposed to do. Like, for instance, if you think about AoE stops, like why Demon Hunter was so OP is it had all these spells that weren't really meant to be disruption to like CC a pack for 10 seconds, but it did effectively because it made all the spells go on cooldown. Stuff like, double fear sigil or whatever, or the AoE stun. And so now it's like, for instance, leg sweep. Okay, this does stun all of the mobs for 3 or 4 seconds. So this is, you use this to maybe help your tank stay alive or to buy yourself a little bit of time. Whereas a spell like In Cap Roar will only buy you that very short moment and disrupt things for a short period of time. Fear, maybe, you care more about the fact that fear makes the mobs run away or if you don't hit them or whatever. Like each individual CC harkens back more to what it was designed for or what it was supposed to be, rather than literally every single thing just being another way to kick a spell.
Yeah. It does suck that single target stops are completely useless now, and everybody has like 100 different AoE CCs.
Yeah. Also, any mob that it feels like you would want to single target stop is just a lieutenant now. Like, that's the other downside, I think, is like those really hard hitting like tank mobs or whatever. Like, they just, for instance, in the Miss Maze, you just can't even CC them anyway. You can't hodge them or like stun them or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just remember the days back in Underrot. You had your druid on the blood swarmers just spamming hibernate.
That was sick.
Oh yeah,
that was sick.
that was definitely the abuse of the no stop meta, but like, I don't think that should happen again. I hope that was a one-time thing, but I'm sure Tettles enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, this is really great. I don't know. It's just weird. I think that we've power crept classes CC like way too much, to the point where like in the past, Rogue was like this single target stop specialist, and Druid and Monk had AOE stops. Now everybody's a Druid and Monk in terms of how many AOE stops they have. Everybody's got the same amount of single target stops as the Rogue in their past life. Like I don't know. I think that the amount of CC has just been power crept so much.
Yeah.
Then you got Aug with like rotational knockup and shit. Like I don't know, man. Like what is going on with that?
Yeah, it's definitely a good point though. Like these AOE stops are getting nerfed a lot because of they don't, they like spells just immediately recast, right? So I do think that'll actually help bring that back. Like it seems like these spells are really OP. Like I remember there was a joke about how people were talking about, oh, let's make other classes be able to be Drakthir, right? Well, Drakthir has 2 racials that are AoE stops, and it was like, if things stayed the way they were in Dragonflight, it would just be every team in M+ is just an army of dragons, just like spinning around, tails everywhere, mobs like flying in the air over and over again, like it's just a bouncy house on every pack. Like that would have been so bad.
I did have one last question about dungeons before we kind of move on. If you could make one change to any of the season 1 dungeons, what would it be?
You're talking like mechanical, right? You're not talking about
anything.
like a system wide change.
Yeah, mechanical, like something about one of the dungeons.
I would make Dawnbreaker more intuitive as to what you're supposed to do with the mini bosses. As it currently stands, like right now, there's like these pillars of light that you can land in. That is next to like the Dawnbreaker mini bosses, and whenever you kill one of the mini bosses, it's like kind of similar to Court of Stars, where it like takes a debuff stack off the boss, making the boss have less HP and do less damage to you. So you have to kill all 3 of these mini bosses, but it's not very clear where they're supposed to be, and it's not very clear where you're supposed to land. I don't even know how I would fix it, but that is something that, in my opinion, should be like a top priority for Blizzard to fix, because like it is not intuitive.
GROWL?
Jeez. One change only.
Right.
I think for me, the one an annoying part and a not fun part of a dungeon is the end of Stone Vault. Stone Vault's like a pretty fun dungeon. It also has different paths. There's some optional packs. The last boss to me is like so weird. It's like an AoE denial fight where it drops these puddles, but like the puddles are just so big. Like I don't even know what it's just like so little uptime. Like you're always like running around and like going in these portals, and it just like I don't know what I would do other than just like delete it. I just don't really. Maybe people will come up with a smart strategy on that boss, but to me that's like Stone Vault could be. I always kind of like those like shorter, really hard to heal dungeons, and Stone Vault could be that if it wasn't for this like grueling fight of the last boss where like your melee have to run off the boss across the room to like go in this portal to drop their debuff off, and they just don't, and they're just standing on the debuff. I'm a Frost DK, I can death strike this, just taking 80% of their health per tick because they've been sitting with this debuff for the whole time because they don't want to get off the boss. All
right, so let's wrap this up. Final concluding thoughts. I'll start this off. I think in general, the dungeon pool isn't like the greatest dungeon pool I've ever had. I do still think that the dungeons are fairly solid in some aspects, even though they aren't the greatest. I've been having a lot of fun still playing them. I think that there's going to be ups and downs, but I think it does really feel like, and it's presenting itself to be like a pretty solid M+ season. I also do enjoy the fact that a lot of these dungeons are on the shorter end. I think that Blizzard is really trying to make sure that you don't really have any 40-minute stinkers, no more DOS 40-minute endeavors, no more Halls of Infusion or Halls of Valor 45-minute dungeons. I think we're kind of past that.
What's the longest dungeon?
35, I think.
That's good. Huge dub. Blizzard chill here.
I think it's so Dawnbreaker was 35 and it got reduced to 30. I want to say Borealis is like 35.
Yeah, that's a huge dub. Yeah, overall, I think they're going to be difficult. Bosses are hard. I think from a high-level perspective, the replayability of this season is going to be very questionable with no affixes, with more linear dungeons. However, I think this is going to be such a good experience for anybody who's not a super sweaty key pusher. I think the progression up to +10s is going to be so much better with the new affixes. I think, in general, like not having to do any big pulls or do any crazy stops, I think there are a certain group of people that appreciate that. Like, just the dungeon experience feels more tailored for, like, they're trying to make this dungeon for what an average person is doing rather than what a high-end M+er is doing. And while I can be like, man, I want it to be for me. Like, I think a lot of people will actually, if they can get past the difficulty and the challenge of the dungeons, I think they will enjoy it. And I think that there's also, a lot of cool different, environments. Like, as much as I'm like, oh, I hate Siege coming back. Like, dude, Siege is like aesthetically a pretty cool dungeon. Like, you do feel like you're back in BFA when you're doing Siege for sure.
Yeah, you get to deal with these Black Tar Bombers and Iron Tide Raiders. Oh, what fun.
Okay. Maybe I am too positive.
These mobs are ass.
I think for me, like as not a key pusher, I actually like the complexity of the raid bosses. A lot of people want 10-man raiding back, and I think a lot of people are going to get that small person, mini progression on some of the bosses, especially doing it under geared, that they will have a lot of fun with. I think it'll be frustrating in pugs, especially people who don't know the mechanics. But I do think there is a large subset of people who do want this kind of thing, and I think it's going to be great for them going in, and we'll have a ton of fun on M0. Even if the rewards aren't great, I think they'll do that.
I mean, that's one of the reasons that like 5-man content like M+ is so sick. It's because like it's that ragtag group of gamers that it's like puggable content as well, and it's like there's infinitely scaling, so you can get people about on your same level to go and do the dungeons with you, and I think that's what makes M+ great. I would love to see 10-man rating come back though.
Yeah. And just to throw it in, the one change that I would make is for the Mist Maze. I would just have all the symbols just show up all the time.
Oh,
just show the symbols all the time. I don't know why you need to walk close to it. It makes it a healer job. Like, just make them show, and then everybody can be like, it's that one. Then your healer doesn't have to walk around like an idiot the entire time, not healing and doing things.
That is actually a sick change. Hold on, can you lobby? Can you lobby for that?
That was well thought out. He had that one ready.
I did have that one ready. I want that change because I don't think it's fun for anybody to watch your healer not do damage, walk around, touch all the pillars, and then forget the second one, have to go back and check it again, and then choose the wrong one. You're all back at the start.
I've been doing it a little bit on Aug, and it is miserable on Aug too because you're just
like let's just cut the middleman out, show all of them just like the boss, and everybody can be like, it's that one, and then you go. You're still doing the mechanic. You don't need a weak aura or any kind of hack weak aura to figure it out. Just show it, Blizzard.
Okay, the last topic we have for today is one that's non-controversial at all. People love this topic. We're going to be talking about Augmentation Evoker, and people want blood.
Oh yeah, people are so sick of Aug.
Dude, people, I get people in my chat every single day whenever I'm playing Aug, and they're like, is Aug gonna be meta? Is Aug gonna be meta? ZZZZZ, Aug again. Why are we playing Aug? The 6th season of Aug. It's not even that they want it to be tuned, they want it fucking dead.
Yeah.
I'm reading this comment on Terathal's video. Someone just wrote, and this is the highest upvoted comment, I'm glad the entire game has to be made worse for a majority of players because we just can't admit we made a mistake. I mean, I would argue that for a majority of players, Aug is like average or just bad. Like I
agree.
I think it's just people just hate seeing it in high keys and they hate the meta. I mean, I think the biggest problem with Aug, flat out, is just that it's not necessarily a DPS, it's a support spec, right? And it's taking roles of, like, positions of DPS players. DPS already struggles so much with getting into groups because it's the most popular role by, like, a huge margin. And now we have, you're basically limiting DP. Like, imagine if Blizzard came out with an update that said, okay, dungeons are now 4-man, there's only 2 DPS slots instead of 3. People would be up in arms. And that's sort of what Aug has done up till now, is that every group, at least at a high level, feels like they need an Aug. I don't really know what it's like pugging in low keys. My experience when I played my mage, now granted this was only season 4 and for a short time, but people weren't really like, oh, we need an Aug. Like, that was never, at any key level that I did, 19 or lower, did at any point where people like, oh, we need an Aug. But I don't know, maybe you guys have a different experience?
I have a similar experience, dude. Like, even in Dragonflight Season 3, like, I didn't even play with an Aug. I played Fire Mage, Balance Druid, Shadow Priest. Like, that was our primary comp that we played the most. I played with GROWL even a decent amount in Season 3, and it's like, we didn't need an Aug that season. And I think that that's especially true for, like, even like at weekly keys, I would not be bringing an Augmentation Evoker. I don't think that you're getting the value out of the Aug that high-end groups are doing, but I think it's one of this, it's like a trickle-down effect where you see the high-end groups playing with an Augmentation Evoker, and so you just like have this notion that you should be playing with it because you think it's better for whatever reason, even though you don't fully understand what those reasons are.
I think it's only at the start of the season and high keys that you see people doing Aug, or like wanting Aug and Pugs. Because at that point, it's kind of like progression keys. It's like you're pushing, you're trying to do a weekly 10, but under geared, and therefore you want your healer to be more powerful. You want your tank to be more survivable, and therefore you do have the groups looking for an Aug to kind of make their chances better at that point. And, you're probably going to have people who are probably better who are looking for a 10 early in the season. That's the only time that I've seen it personally. Otherwise, at this point, I think people to grab just 3 DPS and go.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to talk about I think some people are not fully understanding exactly what makes Aug so good. And a lot of people point to the utility of Aug. They say, oh, Zephyr and Cauterize and this and that. And it's like, well, Dev has all that and no one complains about Dev or Prez, right? And ultimately, every class has good utility. The real thing that Aug brings that differs it from every other spec in the game is that while it's also buffing your DPS, it's buffing your tank and your healer. It's giving main stat to your tank and your healer that allows them to be more tanky and keep your team alive more in dungeons. And I do think that the fallout for Blizzard, if they can't get Aug balance right, is to stop buffing tanks and healers. And Yoda brought this up a little bit in our talk with him last week, in that, as a tank and a healer, and let's be honest, it's a tank and healer's world, right? Like you don't make a group. If you have only DPS players, you don't make a group, right?
Dude,
like
the tank goes, I need an Aug. You say, yes, honey, I'm finding one for you.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it just is the way it is. And so when Aug makes keys easier for the tank and healer, that's another reason why you see, and, Dorky jokes about it, but at the same time, like, he's on beta keys and he's like, oh, I'll do keys if we can get an Aug, because, why make your life harder? Even if it isn't even the best, like, ideal comp or whatever, it's like, if this makes the tank and healer's job easier, why not bring it? And unfortunately, I think if all else fails, they just need to make it so it only buffs other DPS and it stops. Because I don't think the utility that it brings is anywhere near enough to be like, oh, Aug is mandatory. I think it's strictly the fact that it's buffing the tank and healer.
I think it legitimately has the same amount of utility as like a mage, like if you really think about it. But like at the same point, the buffing tank and healer. And I think maybe my meta reads a little bit different than other people's, but I think that we are going into a meta where tank survivability is going to be very important, and healer HPS throughput is going to be very important. And that's not a meta that you really see too often. In Dragonflight, a lot of the times it was like one-shot prevention was the most important thing. But like if it's tank survivability and healer HPS throughput, you know what Ebonmite does? It increases both of those things. You know what Blistering Scales does? It increases your tank's ability to be able to live getting white swung on.
Yeah. I think there's also kind of like a side thing of like, it's only applicable to like very certain circumstances, but the fact that you are buffing other people as Aug as well does mean that the Aug is benefiting from effects that normally would only affect one person. People talk about power infusion all the time. UPI, the mage, we had the god comp. The Aug is essentially stealing PI on both the mage and the priest as well. And there's also a boss, I think, in Stone Vault, where like you pick up a buff that does bonus damage to a shield. Normally you only have a limited amount, but every person that picks it up is technically going to the Aug as well.
It's like Raging Tempest as well, right?
Yeah. The Aug doesn't need the bonus damage or healing. They're just stealing it off other people. There's more orbs for everybody else. So there's like minor instances like that, but I think the bigger thing is what you covered.
I think Terrathal actually made a video talking about will augmentation be meta once again, and he actually drew an insane graph in Paint. But I think he actually like outlines it really well. It's like, are the timers tight? If the answer is no to the timers being tight, the question then goes to does the Aug still buff the tank and the healer? If the answer is yes, then you always bring the Aug. Now that's also predicated off the timers not being tight. But if you look at this right here, if the timers are tight, there's still a lot of reasons that you would bring the Augmentation Evoker, right? That is beyond them doing like a lot of damage.
Yeah,
Squishy brings up a really good point about compounding buffs. That's been a very, very hot topic lately, is the idea behind raid buffs. People are starting to really push M+ to its limits, right? And the realization that wait a second, the mage buffs the healer, right? Like that's not really a thing that people even thought about in BFA, right? Of like, that while Arcane Intellect is good, like, that is actually kind of sick. Like 5% healing is, 5% intellect or whatever. Like that's a lot, that's talking about a key level, let's say a key level increases in difficulty roughly 10% or whatever. If you combined all those buffs of the Arcane Intellect, maybe the Mark of the Wild, and then the Aug, like you're looking at, arguably an entire key level worth of buffs that you're adding to your team. And like Squishy said, with any other random thing in the dungeon or whatever, like you're compounding all this stuff on top of each other when you're like, the mage gets PI'd by the priest, and then that's being amplified by the Aug, and then it's also being amplified by Mark of the Wild, which is buffing the Aug, which is buffing them more, and it's like, It definitely creates a weird... it's hard to say, because on one hand, raid buffs, like, they seem very good. Like, on the other hand, if they just tune things terribly, like, we might see a triple shaman comp, and then no one will bat an eye, right? Like, I just think it's... Ultimately, it still does come down to, like, however they tune things, though.
I think Blizzard will do this thing sometimes where specs deal 20% more damage, and if you just have a couple... Dude, one of the most... do you remember that double survival hunter warlock tier that we had for M+?
Oh, yeah.
I can't think of the biggest piece of shit comp out of your DPS than double survival hunter warlock. Like, they don't do anything. Serve hunter and warlock, like, what CC? They're not doing shit. They're not helping your group. They're just there to do big damn.
Yeah, there was actually a different iteration of that comp that Greg and Psycho and Evade would run, actually triple survival hunter. So when they couldn't feel like finding a warlock, they would just bring a third survival hunter. And that was like considered a good thing. Like people were looking, they're like, wow, they're really abusing this metagame right now. Like ultimately, everyone points fingers at the raid buffs. It's kind of a weird thing to say that if raid buffs are really the deciding factor, then things are actually pretty well balanced. I don't necessarily think that was the case at the end of Dragonflight. I think there were other considerations.
Yes.
But ultimately, like, I think people do have to realize that raid buffs, while not great, like, it's just going to come down to tuning.
I mean, AI can literally just be mathed out. Like, it is just like a math question of like how much value you're getting from Arcane Intellect. You're getting 5% healing and 5% damage from some of your group. Like it is just like you can add the damage to your meter at the end of the run if you want to calculate how much damage AI is bringing. People, I think that like at the end of Dragonflight, all like the best comp just had all of the raid buffs. I don't think it was something where it was like, oh, we're bringing it because it has this raid buff. It was just, oh, we just have all the raid buffs in a great comp.
So I'm going to ask the question, do you enjoy playing Aug, or do you just play it just because it's meta and you get invited? Like what if you do enjoy Aug, maybe like what do you enjoy about playing Aug, or like what are the good parts about it that you don't necessarily... Because okay, I've always sort of seen Moonkin as like a pseudo kind of support role, maybe more so in BFA when it came to like treants and like, some off healing that you had, or like utility and stuff. Like, do you like that support sort of thing, or is that just like, that's just happened to be what you do? Let
me mull this one over for a second. Squishy, you want to answer it? Because you've been playing Aug a lot lately too.
For me, I just like the idea of buffing people. Like I like that playstyle from others. I like also doing direct damage, but it's definitely a different playstyle, and just pressing Evan Might and knowing that my entire party is just doing more and is better is just kind of satisfying. Combined with all the utility, you just feel very impactful. Especially coming from the tank role where I felt not as impactful. Lots of buttons to press, self-healing, like there's just a lot of stuff that I can do to help my team. I mean, as somebody that enjoys raid leading as well, that's kind of just like the perfect spot for me.
Yeah, I think that...
I'll give you more time to think. The one thing that Dorky brought up is he was talking about Lost Ark actually in more modern supports in games, and I don't know if this has a place in WoW, but it would be sort of interesting, because like imagine if instead of replacing a DPS with Aug, you replace the healer, right? And so like imagine if like the way that you dealt with group damage was just like all you had to do was like maintain 1 or 2 buffs on the tank, and then like you had this like, imagine like Zephyr was like insane, for example. Let's say anytime there's group damage, you just press Zephyr, and as long as you press it early, it's like a giant shield and it saves you, right? Like I feel like that would be kind of an interesting archetype in M+, where it's like healing is very easy and it's very OP and it's very damage support oriented, and then you still have 3 DPS. I don't know, maybe I'm way off base here.
I would think that would be more interesting. I do think that your like hardcore long-term career healers would fucking hate that though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it would be sick personally, but that's my opinion.
I personally thought that the Trinity should be abolished for a while.
Oh, all right.
But that is a topic for another time. But I do think that like there's a lot of benefits even from down to the social aspect of it. You can't blame a healer if there isn't one. And then realistically things can be tuned around. It's your fault if you stand in things. It's your fault if you die. There's only so much that this support can do for you. And that's the way Lost Ark was, and I enjoyed that. So but
what would you do?
Huh?
What would you do differently then?
Right now, nothing. That would be such a fundamental change to the game that I think it would take a WoW 2 to do it, and I don't think that's ever happening. So,
what about Fellowship?
Fuck yes.
Is that MMO that's coming out recently?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I know nothing about that
dungeon MMO thing.
Oh, that.
Yeah, now you know what I'm talking about. Yep.
Yes. Okay. Yep. Like, I guess we're kind of getting into it. I think there's just a lot of interesting social applications. I would love to see how it play. Like, I think a set of dungeons where everybody is treated as like any role or all DPS, where things are mostly all avoidable, and anytime you get hit by something, it is your fault. And while having a support to like they can increase your movement speed at the right time, or they can provide you with some defensive value if there's a big thing coming, or a giant shield, like you said. There's some things that a support can do, but realistically, anytime you get hit is your own fault. I would love to see what that looks like. I don't think it'll go over well in WoW.
Yeah, not in WoW. That's the problem. Is there's so many cool ideas.
It would be bad in WoW.
Yeah.
It's a fun thing to think about, though, for sure.
One thing that Dorky brought up, and this has to do with the tank changes, and going back to it's a tank in DPS's or a tank and healers world, it is sort of interesting to think about the concept that a majority of people play WoW as a DPS. Also, a lot of tanks and healers don't necessarily mind just being super OP. What would a world look like if just tanks and healers were just stupidly batshit OP?
That's what I've been saying. That's what I've been saying for the past 2 weeks when I talked about bringing back Vengeance. Just make them fucking OP. I don't care.
I think that it definitely takes away some of the like strategy and interesting decision making stuff about it. But like, what if they just also it doesn't really apply to raid. But what if in an M+ world, like, you just are invulnerable more or less with a tank, and you're just invulnerable more or less with a healer, and like, you just have one button. Like right now, Pres Evoker, a big reason why it's OP is you have a button that does essentially like a full party heal on an under 20-second cooldown. And so the way that you play that class is you literally just walk around and you just mash that button every time there's group damage, and it just full tops everybody, assuming that you did your ramp and your setup properly. And so, like, you know, what if that was healing for every class? Like, every time there's group damage, just press your button, blast, you know, everybody's healed, then you go back to doing your thing. Like, I don't know. I think it would be interesting, but again, I don't know if just that would work for WoW, right? Like, if every single tank and every single healer was OP, but I do think that maybe, in general, people would have more fun as a whole if that was how Mythic Plus was.
The interesting thing, I think, that I just kind of thought of is I actually think the tank role is more support-ish than healer role right now. And well, I think that could be an interesting conversion. You have Prot Paladin right now, which has a lot of utility. I think a lot of tanks, other than playing Blood DK, actually like playing Prot Paladin because it has, you know, the external of sack. It has spell warding or bop. You know, it has the off healing from what is that spell called? The heal.
Word of Glory.
Word of Glory. Like, you have a lot of buttons. You have freedom. You know, like, there's a lot of things that you could do. And, you know, maybe the tank's job transitions from survival to you just survive for free. You're OP in terms of survival unless you go super crazy or something like that, and just turns into you are a support, you help manage your group. Like, that could be an interesting transition.
Some would say they already do that, regardless.
Well, that's sort of what Squishy's saying, right? Like, tank might even be the closest role to a support rather than healers.
like what does warrior do? Intervene, I guess.
Rally and cry.
Rally.
Yeah.
Like I think that is where I would put the support role rather than creating a brand new role. I would just push tanks into more of a support role. Give them more to do.
Yeah, that would actually be, in my opinion, pretty cool. I would not mind tanks and healers being OP. I will say that whenever I think of like OP for tank and healer, I think of them doing damage, and maybe that's the wrong way of approaching like what would necessarily make them like OP, right? Because like kind of like we talked about last week, a DPS would be so salty if they got out DPS by the tank. Like I wouldn't really care. Like, but like if your entire group is getting beat by the tank, it wouldn't even phase me. But I do think that some people would just like be down bad if they were getting beat by the tank.
Yeah, I think that's sort of a, well, this is how it is now, so I would feel bad situation. You know what I mean? Like, the only reason it feels bad to lose to the tank is because, like...
You shouldn't be losing to the tank.
Right, you shouldn't, right?
Yeah.
But if, you know, tanks are OP, and if everybody always loses to the tank all the time, and it's like, well, hey, tanks are needed. If you want to be OP, then you play the tank, right? Like, I think it would be less of a, you know... After that existed for a while. Oh yeah, this is
insane.
I love this article. All this stuff, by the way.
Okay, I was pulling something up while you guys were talking. So one of the there was this like big post about Overwatch 5v5 versus 6v6. I don't really want to get into it too much, but basically the premise of 5v5, one of the big things that they did was it was mandatory 1 tank, 2 healers, 3 DPS. And so there was like this big post talking about the bottlenecking of 6v6 versus 5v5, and one of the reasons that they think that going back to 6v6 wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. And look at this right here. Their queue time went from an average of 7.6 minutes down to an average of like 1.8 minutes once they swapped it to 5v5 because the bottleneck was so bad. The bottleneck for WoW right now, by far, is that we have not enough tanks and not enough healers. And like GROWL was saying, and I think he's like parroted it a couple of times, it is really a tank and healer world. Even if you're like an LFG, even if you're an LFR or something like that, you're always looking for a tank and healer. It is like nearly impossible. Like there's so many groups that just have 3 DPS sitting there waiting for a tank or a healer to sign up.
Yeah, that was my 0 to Hero series. There were so many times when it was just, and none of that made it into any of the videos, but it would just be, I would start a group, and then only DPS would sign up, and it would just be us 3 hanging out in Veldrak, and I'd combust the target dummy a couple times, and then, like, we'd be sitting there for literally sometimes 30 minutes, and then we'd be like, well, can't find anybody, and we'd leave. Like, and I'm sure every DPS who's pugged, like, under geared knows that life.
7.6 minutes for DPS while it's 1.8 minutes for tanks. And then whenever they changed the bottleneck, then it got down to nearly 3 minutes. But like there's just more games forming, right? More people are able to get into groups and stuff like that.
So what you're saying is Mythic plus solo queue.
This is one of the biggest issues that I would have with Mythic plus solo queue, by the way, is that I would be sitting in a 35-minute queue just to get grouped up with some absolute goopers and then just waste 35 minutes of my life.
In this episode of The Bench, we talk about Mythic plus solo queue. What if we deleted healers? And what if we removed the Holy Trinity?
Circling back, I like Aug. I do like Aug. I think that I like it for like weird reasons because like you kind of pointed out, Moonkin, for as long as I've been playing, has more or less been like a job doer spec. I think in some iteration it was supposed to be like Beast Mastery Hunter, but about Legion, somehow that got turned into like Moonkin is able to do all of your jobs in raid and in M+. And then in M+, they have just so much fucking utility that they're in control of like a lot of the mobs and like kind of what's going on. And so to me, that's one of the reasons that I like Aug and M+. On top of that too, I think Aug is just like the natural role to help your tank out and have that like shot caller like tag team where you and your tank are just kind of talking about the entire dungeon and like what's supposed to be happening next. And like whenever you have that rapport with your tank as like an Augmentation Evoker, it really feels like super satisfying. The rotation to me, I've never really cared, but more than anything, I think the biggest and most important thing to me is getting invited to groups. And so while I don't really mind playing Aug, if I was getting benched as an Augmentation Evoker, I would be dropping that spec immediately. I don't care that much. That would get dropped almost instantly.
That is very true. Also, as one final note to talk about tanks and, you know, tank improvement, we're going to have a new section, GROWL's Tip of the Week. You know, this is very important tank information that we learned this week. You know, certain, even higher level tanks don't necessarily know this. So if you're playing the Blood DK specialization, you know, very, very popular tank, you can actually use a two-handed weapon.
You can?
So you can't. I know it does seem counterintuitive, but I was doing keys with my friend Dorky on the beta. He's been playing Blood DK on tons of beta. Making tier lists, giving advice to people. Very look forward to in terms of tanks. And he learned that he was using a one-handed weapon for the entirety of all of his beta testing as a Blood DK. And so while he, didn't rate damage, he was, he's like, why isn't Blood DK's damage so good? And we taught him you can actually use a two-handed weapon on Blood DK. So just in case anyone out there is only using, because I'm sure if Dorky's making this mistake, tons of other people are too. So, just keep that in mind, guys. You can use a two-handed weapon as a Blood DK.
Who pointed this out to him?
Oh, I don't know. It's one of those things. I don't know. To be I'm memeing on them, but dude, who looks at their gear?
I mean,
sometimes you just. Funny enough, my friend Dorky, actually, same Dorky as this, also in the in the beginning of Dragonflight, he had a pair of shoulders that was actually mail on his Blood DK or leather. No. And so he didn't have the plate buff for the entirety of the first week, shows up to raid with the leather shoulders on, and our raid leader says, by the way, you have leather shoulders on as a DK for our heroic week of raiding, when he looked at the logs. And yep, so also wait. Make sure you also want to use plate armor as a Blood DK as well.
Did you guys get Realm first 15? Oh no, you guys were doing 20s. Never mind. It was Dragonflight. Did you guys do a 20 with him wearing leather?
I think we got to 14s, 15s-ish with leather shoulders.
Well, quick follow-up to that. Numerous people have crafted weapons in Dragonflight of the wrong main stat. You may have had certain people that are casters or healers crafting the agility version of a sword, or making a rogue crafting intellect daggers. Just make sure you watch that out in War Within.
All right, and as for my tip, maybe less less useful than make sure you're wearing the right gear. But mine is that Mind Soothe no longer works in dungeons. However, Blizzard has been so kind as to change invisibility potions to be a 10-minute CD. While in isolation you might think this is a bad thing, the good change is that now the invisibility potions no longer share cooldown with your damage potion. So you can use the invisibility potion whenever you want. It's on its own independent cooldown. And while Mind Soothe going away is kind of unfortunate for some of the weird skips that we could do, it's probably fine, especially with invisibility potions being so easily used now.
Yeah, I'm really happy about that change. So it's very good because now your invis pot is your invis pot. The downside is, I was guilty of sometimes there are skips that other people might find easy to do that I just secretly would invis pot them anyway because I was scared I was going to pull the trash, and then I would lie and say that I DPS potted later if I needed to invis, and now I can no longer lie because invis is on a cooldown of its own. So if I don't have an invis pot, then I have to admit that I just invis by the guy that you could just literally walk by.
I can now macro my damage pot into just random cooldown abilities. It is getting the macro.
Confessions of overrated M+ players here.
Dude, you know what? I'll say it. I went an entire season and I didn't go through over 100 damage potions on my Augmentation Evoker. I pressed less than 100 damage pots on my Aug Evoker in Season 3.
Dude, I went through so many damage potions on my mage because I macroed Bloodlust and damage potion, and I probably bloodlusted the target dummies 500 times, and I just never removed it.
That is sick. Well, I mean, mage has invis, so it's fine. My evoker, I just never wanted to run into a situation where I didn't have my invis pot. I just never pressed it. Okay, let's move on to Q&A. First question we got from Thune. This question says, why doesn't Tyrannical simply take the boss mechanic and add another Tyrannical mechanic, similar to Heroic / Mythic Zero mechanic jumps, rather than making the bosses take longer / do more damage? Obviously, this is not something that it can do at this point of the season, but it's still interesting food for thought. Squishy, what do you think about this?
This is something that I have said a while ago, and I think it would be really cool. Back when Tyrannical and Fortified flipped. Now I don't really think it matters as much. I think it'd be really cool. I think the reason they haven't done it is probably just because it takes time and it would take a lot of effort to do so. But
I think Tyran's probably going to get nerfed again.
I think Tyran should get removed. Now I'm officially on the remove Tyran train for high keys. Because the thing, all right, here's the thing.
Welcome.
Fortified Tyran existed because it changed the pace of the dungeons drastically, right? It made it so you had to think about when you use your cooldowns, what the difficult parts of the dungeon. It existed for a reason. You may not have liked that reason, but that's why it was there. I'm not saying it was good. That's just why it existed. Now it doesn't serve that purpose in high keys, right? It's always Fort, it's always Tyran. Now here's the thing. You might say, but GROWL, that's just the same as nothing. But the problem is Fortified is arguably more fun than Tyrannical, right? The trash lives longer, you get to deal your damage, the bosses don't feel like such of a drag. If everything is going to be the same, I would like to see things lean more towards, more time on trash, less time on bosses. To address the question of the Tyrannical thing, the problem is, I think that, again, the purpose of Tyrannical in my mind is to change, again, the pace and the cadence of the dungeon, to change the difficulty. While I agree with Squishy that the main reason is because there's no way they're going to put the time to do that. I also don't think adding mechanics to bosses necessarily serves that purpose. An idea that I had, though, at one point was, I think it would be very interesting for a seasonal affix, especially an end of an expansion one, to be add one mechanic to each of the bosses and then have it rotate each week. So, for example, let's say you add one mechanic on every single boss, right? And so the first week, it's every single first boss has a new mechanic. Then the next week, every single second boss, so it's only one little thing that gets changed, but it's like, that was kind of, or maybe even bosses and odd bosses, and it's like a 1-2 rotation or whatever. But that was sort of my idea for if they're going to bring back dungeons that they've already used in the expansion or that they've used before, maybe add small little twists to them, and then that's like a seasonal affix.
Pedals?
All right, next question for Q&A. We have a tweet at us from Desarius. He says, at the bench, wow. What do you guys think of adding a track upgrade item for weekly vault currency so we can upgrade a heroic track piece to myth for the cost of one full weekly vault? All right. This might be an unpopular opinion. I think the vault currencies are dog shit. I don't like them at all. I don't like having to socket my pieces of gear from the vault. I don't like the concept of the thoughts of having to buy tertiaries from the vault either. Whenever people always bring that up, I think the vault currencies are really, really bad. I do think that the socket one at least serves a purpose, because I think that having to RNG sockets is also miserable, but I don't like vault currencies as a general rule, and I also don't like this one. Not that I don't think that you should be able to upgrade hero track to mythic. I think that that's maybe a little bit of a different question. I just don't like vault currencies as a general rule.
I think the current is boring. I agree with you there. I think that it should exist, because getting a bad vault is really, really frustrating. Like,
why do you get a bad vault? Why can you get a bad vault?
Well, that's the thing, but I mean, it's RNG, right? That is part of the loot pinata that you get every Tuesday. When you go to the vault, you're like, ooh, I wonder what's in my vault. Like, I think that there is some excitement there. The problem is the bad luck protection for getting a bad vault doesn't match your disappointment for getting a bad vault. Right now, you get a socket, and that is not great. Or I think you get 6,000 gold or something. It's like, why? I think this is more along the right track. I don't think this is what Blizzard would want to do, because you're essentially getting a piece of gear that is higher than the content that you've done. And there is some level there. I could see it maybe being worth 2 or 3 great vaults, but that at a premium.
Do you remember PvP medallions?
Well, that's sort of what I was thinking
trophies?
When I read his idea of you have to be doing that level of content, right? And then you get a trophy or whatever as one of your vault things. Yeah. That's sort of what I read it as, maybe not a currency, but I don't know. I think my opinion of it is, the more that I think about it, I don't know if this is going to be super unpopular, but I actually think Myth Track gear sucks. I think they should delete Myth Track. I think Mythic Raid and High Keys. I think Mythic Raid and High Keys should be cosmetic and achievement only. I don't think you should have to force players to do really, really hard coordinated group content to max out their characters. And I think they should just delete Myth Track gear.
As a Lost Ark enjoyer, Squishy, what do you think about that?
I think that you can upgrade to Myth Track, but it's at a 5% chance, and it's random. So every week,
but you can pay to increase it to 15%. Yep.
New microtransaction. There we go. I mean, people are subbing to early access. Like next, we're just gonna get microtransactions that you can just 5% chance, or you can buy the premium to make it a 20% chance.
Well, what if you... All right, hold on. What about this? You get the Epic Edition of War Within, and then you get early access to your vault. So you get your vault on Monday instead of Tuesday. That would be sick.
Whoa, what if you get a global release for the raid as well? If you buy the Super Deluxe Edition or something.
If you're EU, you get the NA reset. Yeah. Damn, we're cooking. We should get hired.
All right. Next question by Shaka Flocka. He says, question for the Benches Q&A. My M Plus group has been playing together for quite a while, progging from barely KSM and Shadowlands to capping around 15s this most recent season. We've never really committed to the meta comp, but try and play specs that are still strong. Like we had a Vintage's Demon Hunter. Since I was Melee, I played Ret. Do you think that committing to a full meta comp would help us push towards title at all? GROWL, I think you should field this one probably.
Yep. Most important thing is that you enjoy the game. Never play a class if you're not having fun. Me personally, playing meta stuff does not ruin my enjoyment whatsoever, so it doesn't matter to me, but some people really like their class and they want to play it. However, the big thing about playing meta comp is it allows you to troubleshoot what's going wrong and what you can do better much more easily. So for example, let's say you're in 15s and you're thinking, how do I do this pull in an 18? Let me look at, whoever's stream. They're running the same comp as you and they have all the same tools that you have. So you can say, oh, they did this, they grouped this in, blah, blah, blah. Again, it's still possible with your comp, but you're going to have to be the one that does that troubleshooting, which might be hard if you're pushing, you're already pushing the kind of limits of what you're capable of. You're really going to have to go 5-head with coming up with solutions. But when you're running the meta comp, you can see exactly what, Andy Brew does to gather this pull with your tank, and you can do global for global the exact same thing that he does. And to me, that's the most important thing. It's not so much that your class is so OP, but you have the answers. Like one thing I remember when I was pushing early is I played Mistweaver when Druid was popular, and I found very quickly that I had to figure out how to heal these bosses at a top level, and I'm like, dude, I'm not cut out for this. I just started playing this class. Like, I don't know, like, why do I have to figure out how to heal a 22 Galvas? Like, whereas the resto Druid, I could literally just pull up Zmok or J.B or anybody's stream and be like, oh, he's doing this and this and this is his gear, and now I can replicate this.
Yeah. I do want to warn just to be careful though, because some people, if you're not familiar with a class, you might end up just playing worse. Or have some issues with a lot more mistakes that cost you a pull, stuff like that. Especially from on the raid side, but also applies to Mythic Plus. Somebody who isn't familiar with the class is going to lack the intricacies, the tech, the practice, the innate muscle memory to know what to do in panic moments, because there are panic moments that are going to happen. So you are kind of giving a little, taking a little. It's just kind of a risk reward for you and your team, basically, in my opinion.
I think that you the viewer already understand that there's going to be some concessions that you have to make. This is the person that I think that you should be looking at already is Crit Cake. If you're really looking to maybe play something that's not meta, I don't think you necessarily have to play meta even to get the rank 1 title. If your goal is to become a title range player, going from KSM to 15s, by the way. That's impressive. That's a pretty big jump in terms of skill differential. So that's already a pretty big thing to be doing as a group. There's going to have to be some accommodations you're going to have to make with your comp. I think you're already aware of this by, last season you had to play Vintage Demon Hunter. This is what it is. I think that a good group that shows that you don't have to always play super meta stuff is Crit Cake. If you see, he played Vintage Demon Hunter. They play with the Resto Shaman, not necessarily described as a great healer. Arms Warrior, again, Warrior, not exactly the biggest meta DPS. They play with the Ret Paladin, which was okay, and they play with the Rogue, which also was okay. But that's not that wasn't a top tier comp, and Crit Cake was still ranked 21st in terms of DPS in EU, 45th in the world. He was 73rd in the world for all roles and classes. So even while they were playing something that would kind of be deemed as a bad composition, they were still able to do very high title range keys. That's not just a low range title key group. That is a high range title key group. But I think that the biggest thing that you need to know is your troubleshooting and your ability to be able to like learn what your route is going to be, especially if you're playing something that's like drastically different than what the meta group is exactly what GROWL was saying. Your troubleshooting is just going to be very, very different. So having like a good understanding of what your classes can and can't do is important for that. Okay, final question comes from Red. It says, my question for you three is, what are your thoughts on if the hero trees were used to give current existing specs more of a support role function? An external way to access utility that they don't have, such as dispels, but also additional ways to buff their party. Same choice as like an Aug Evoker makes. I give up some of my personal damage so that we all live longer, just to make that support function available to more classes and customize it to each spec. Obviously, this change can't be made in the War Within. Just curious as to what your thoughts on that idea would be. I think they could have gone with this with hero talents. I think they could have gone with this idea with hero talents, but I think that players in general just... I think that this would have to be something that Blizzard would have to really be well thought out on. I don't think that the players would really respond well to something like this, though.
I think Dratnos had a really good take with something similar to this in the regards of people say support spec, but what do they mean? Like, really what they mean is like some class that's just an overpowered DPS, right?
Is that
like
all
you're
they
looking
want?
at
Yeah.
You're looking at Aug and it's like, well, Aug is overpowered because it's doing the same damage that every other DPS is doing, and that it's also buffing your tanks and healers, right? So it's like one of those things where, okay, let's make 4 more support classes. Well, if all of those are just, you know, the same as Aug, where they just do the same damage, but then they're buffing the tank and healer, well, why not just then you're just going to bring 3 support classes, right? And the only reason why it works with Aug is because you can only bring 1 Aug, because if you have 2 Augs, it doesn't work, right? Because you can't buff each other. And they're, you know, you would have to completely rework the way a spec works so that you can't stack multiple supports. If that's the archetype of a support is, oh, this is just BS, like, you know, this is just a DPS, but it also is buffing your team unnecessarily. I do think, I agree with you in the sense that it could be possible if they did hero talents, but it would need to be very well thought out. I think the closest thing they could do is like something along the lines of what we were saying if when we were talking about Lost Ark, of just like, you know, give classes a button, you know what I mean? Like, just every hero talent is just give your class some OP button, right? Like, you just press it and it just buffs everybody, right? And then you just like slam it on, you know, something very, very simple or whatever. But I just don't think it, you know, to try and, oh, how do we make Ret Paladin buff, you know, but still be Ret Paladin, but also do comparative damage, but not be OP? Like, it would just be way too complex of a puzzle, I think, to solve in hero talents.
Yeah, I think the furthest I would go is just like minor support stuff, minor utility stuff. Like, I think you have Fire Mage giving a minor crit buff to their teammates, or like a couple people, something like that.
I think they used to have that. I don't think they have that anymore.
Oh, was that removed? Okay, well,
I think it was removed after Legion.
Okay, fair enough. Or like, you know, a minor movement speed buff or something like that. Just small little things, but I don't think hero talents are exactly the right spot for that.
I mean, people already complain about power infusion, and they were complaining about black attunement.
Yeah,
HP
that's a
gain.
good point, actually.
I don't know if I don't know if players are ready for something like that.
Yeah, again, that's sort of what I'm saying is like, when people say support, I think mainly what they think of is like Aug, which is a DPS, but just buffs way more than any other DPS, right? Like, basically give every class Mark of the Wild is what it is, right? And it's like, well, you know, I don't think that could be an archetype that they have, but I would, in my opinion, if they did that, I think it would be way more suited to be the healer role rather than taking away a DPS role for that. Like, if they're really going to shake things up and, like, you know, like, I think having the healer be, like, some OP spec that just, you know, but they shouldn't remove a DPS from groups because there's already so many DPS.
I will say as well, like, even if they add, say they added a 6th slot, right? I think this is what some people love to bring this up. What if we added a 6th slot to dungeons and it was just for supports? I think that this is going to continue to keep this bottleneck like really bad for DPS players to be able to get into groups. And I think in general, some people would actually enjoy like a support playstyle, but those are probably the people that are already playing tank and healer. Like, these are probably the people who aren't playing DPS.
That's me,
anyways.
right? I mean, I played support in Lost Ark. I played support in offlane and like MOBAs. Like, that's
I love
me.
support and
I play
MOBAs
healer.
Well. Yeah,
exactly. And I play healer. So What if they added? What if it was a 6-person dungeon group, but they just added another DPS slot? So it's 4 DPS.
God, I mean,
Does that solve the issue?
you'd probably find more. It'd probably make it easier to find groups. Does it solve the issue?
I feel like it doesn't necessarily solve the issue, but it would probably make it easier for the Aug to not buff the tank or healer. Which
God,
guess
I mean, that would be so many moving pieces if it was just like if it was just a 4th DPS in a dungeon. I actually struggled to like really grasp like how large in scope that would change, because that would actually just like change the structure of your dungeons by such a large amount.
Now that would change the healing structure as well, because you're now healing an extra person to
Healing would be weird. There are a lot of healing abilities that are like very, but I mean, they would just change it.
Wild
like,
growth hits
like
5 people, right? Or does it hit 6?
Right. Well, I mean, they would just change every healing ability that only heals 5 to make it heal 6. Is how they'd have to
They would just leave it at 5.
just leave it. I mean, there's a surprising number of abilities like that where it's like it's supposed to be a smart heal, but it just heals randomly 4 people, and it's just like, okay, well, the one guy just gets screwed then. Like, for instance, Spirit Bloom only heals 4, and it's like usually your tank doesn't get the heal when there's group damage, but like, you know, what if your tank happens to take a big hit during the group damage, and then like, okay, well, now your Moonkin just randomly doesn't get healed by the Spirit Bloom, and it's like,
dude.
okay,
Yeah. All right. I think that was it for the Q&A, and I think that will be it for this week's episode of The Bench, powered by Wowhead. Thank you guys all so much for watching. We will see you guys next week. The next couple of episodes, we're going to be starting ramping up some of the War Within content. I think next week, what was our topic that we discussed?
what to do for the War Within launch.
Yes. What's gearing for the War Within launch?
gearing and all that stuff, because that's going to be, so the next week is going to be what the week. The next episode comes out right before the early access.
Yes.
And then before the main launch as well. So we're going to just talk about, you know, all the stuff. Delves, very important. It is the Delve episode. Stay tuned.
I've been waiting so long.
We yearn for the mines. All right, but we'll be back next week. Hope to see you guys there, and we will see you guys later. Goodbye.
Peace.